wonderful privilege to be able to be here with you. I wasn't here yesterday, but I heard that yesterday was an incredibly good day. God was incredibly good to us. I noticed as I was coming in this morning that it's snowing. Is it still snowing? Yeah, still snowing. A friend of mine used to say that precipitation is a sign of God's blessing. I don't know, I was born in West Africa and snow's still snow to me, so, still freezing cold. But it is a pleasure and a blessing to be here and to be able to share from God's word with you. As Paul said, my passion is in the development of leaders, and when I was invited to come and share, I already had a sense of what I should be sharing with you. I know that as a movement, you're going through some challenging times, and I'm trusting that what I have to bring, what I have to share, will fall on the ground of open hearts, and that God will do what he longs to do in each one of us. So what I want to do is just to begin really with a story. And this is the story, some of you may have heard it before. It's a story about a man who wanted to change the world. So he tried everything that he could in order to change the world, but he wasn't successful. He found that he couldn't really accomplish anything. So he thought to himself, maybe I've set my sights too wide. Maybe I've set my sights too high. Maybe what I need to do is focus on changing my country. So he began to do everything in his power and in his strength to try to change his country. And then discovered that actually he was just as unsuccessful at trying to change his country. And he decided that maybe I just need to narrow my focus, narrow my gaze, and he decided that what he would do would be to work on his region and his neighborhood. And you know where this is going, still without success. So he thought to himself, what I'll do then is I'll just focus on my family. And he did everything that he could to try to change his family. And to his disappointment, again, unsuccessful. So then he said to himself, what I will do is I will try and change myself. And he began to work on himself. And the strange thing was that as he began to work on himself, his family began to change. And as his family began to change, his neighborhood began to change, his region began to change, and as his region began to change, his nation began to change, and as his nation began to change, the world began to change. Every single leader is faced with the challenge of personal growth. And how we choose to grow determines the kind of leaders we become. So what I want to do this morning is to talk to you about leading from the inside out. What it means to lead from the inside out. Many of us are like the man in the story. We want to make a difference in our world. We want to see God's purposes enacted through us. We want to progress what God is doing. But like this man, we typically begin in the wrong place. We begin with the outer world rather than the inner world. And I believe that God is imminently interested, concerned, preoccupied with the inner world of leaders. So I want us to focus on the story of Moses this morning. Because Moses is a great example of God's preoccupation with the inner world of a leader. His story is full of the kind of internal scripts and personal convictions and character commitments that make for good and for poor leadership behaviors. The life of Moses is also important because in him we find a man whose heart is after God. He's a humble man. In fact, the biblical text tells us that he's the meekest man on earth, a friend of God. And Moses doesn't emerge from the womb with these characteristics and with these credentials. They're worked into his character through an inner and an outer journey that results in him becoming one of the greatest leaders of all time. He's also a great example of a leader who was not designated a professional religious leader in his leadership. Wasn't a minister or a pastor in the traditional sense. So he speaks to all leaders, regardless of where you lead and how you lead. He brings that challenge to each one of us. It's believed that Moses had a stammering tongue. And yet he was developed, he was raised for leadership, for public leadership in Pharaoh's court. And certainly as far as we can tell from the historical words about him, he acquitted himself well in Pharaoh's court. But just like the rest of us, Moses had to face issues that threatened to sabotage his leadership. And these issues arose at every stage of his leadership progress. I want to be a good Baptist this morning, but I'm probably not going to be. I want to focus on 3 specific hurdles that Moses had to face throughout the course of his leadership. These hurdles are also growing pains. Hurdles we also have to face in order to become the kind of leaders God can trust to administer his intentions and to progress his purposes in the earth. Now, these hurdles don't necessarily follow in order in our leadership experience. They often overlap. And if they do anything at all, they kind of follow the path of a spiral in our leadership experience. A spiral that takes us deeper into ourselves, but also deeper into God. But the reality is that if we're serious about serving Jesus through our leadership, we will eventually have to come face to face with the same 3 major hurdles that Moses experienced in his leadership. The first is this: what you know about yourself that no one else knows. The second is this: what others know about you that you may not know. And the final one is this: what you and others may not know about you, but God alone knows. And what Moses knew about himself, but nobody else knew, almost prevented him from getting started on the path of leadership altogether. Like a car with an inexperienced driver, he almost stalled before he started his journey of leadership. And this particular hurdle is a reminder that no leader emerges out of a vacuum. Every leader comes from somewhere, and we all come with baggage. So what I want to do is read part of the text of Moses' story. I love the biblical text, so you're going to hear a lot of it in our time together. I want to read part of the text from Exodus 3, just chunks of it there, and a couple of verses from Exodus chapter 4. So it begins like this. Moses in the burning bush. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them. One of the things we have to understand about God is that his timing is often very different from ours. So Israel's been in bondage for 400 years, and we're not told why God chose this day and not the day before or the day after to come down and to speak into the situation, but we understand that that was the day that God had an appointment with Moses and with his people. But what we do understand is that God has his own timing, but God, who has his own timing, also hears everything. Not one prayer was wasted. He says, I've heard them. So I just want to say to those of you who feel that you've been praying for a long time for something to happen, if it's not 400 years yet, you're doing okay. So verse 8, so I've come down, God says, to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Lots of ites in the land. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. And I have to say that I really love this part of the passage, because God has just said, I've come down to rescue my people. And then he says to Moses, so you go. Whenever we begin to feel a stirring in our hearts about something, a passion, an irritation, a frustration, often what we're feeling is the heart of God over a thing. And when God says he's going to do something in our region or in our town or in our family or in our city or in our neighborhood, oftentimes we're the ones being approached with the invitation. God works through us. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I've watched over you and have seen what was done to you in Egypt. And I've promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, all of the ites, a land flowing with milk and honey. Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. Moses answered, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say the Lord did not appear to you? Verse 10. Moses said to the Lord, O Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said to him, who gave man his mouth? Who makes him deaf or mute? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. But Moses said, O Lord, please send someone else to do it. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. So right here we discover the greatest challenge that every leader will face at some point in their leadership. That the challenge of leading others emerges out of the challenge of leading ourselves. Some of you may recognize yourself in this stage of Moses' development as a leader. Here I am, Lord, send anybody else, somebody else. Moses tries to evade God by posing 3 questions which are really excuses, but every question sounds like a good reason when your identity is at stake. And the first of the 3 questions Moses asked was a question of authenticity. And we see it in Exodus 3:13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? In other words, Moses asked, are you really who I think you are? An authenticity question. And these questions can come to us at any point in our Christian walk, any point of our Christian leadership. They emerge whenever we project onto God our disappointments from the past, our challenges, our failed relationships, our struggles. We often find ourselves wrestling with authenticity questions when things go wrong, or when we make mistakes that have far-ranging implications. The interesting thing is that we also ask authenticity questions even when we've witnessed miracle after miracle and breakthrough after breakthrough. Moses was standing before a perpetually combusting bush and asking the Lord, are you really who I think you are? Are you the Almighty God? Are you truly in control? Are you going to make me look stupid if I say yes? Are you going to let me down? Are you really who I think you are? And God answers Moses in the most spectacular way possible. He reveals his true nature to Moses. He says to him, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And even as God was answering, Moses was powering up for his next excuse or question, And this was a credibility question. And we see it in Exodus 4, verse 1. Moses answers with, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? In other words, what if they don't believe that I'm who you think I am? What if I can't prove myself? What if they laugh in my face? What if I just don't have the credentials to be a deliverer? Moses was asking, God, are you sure you've come to the right address? Do you know about me? Am I really who you think I am? And even if I am, what if no one else believes me? It's all very well and good speaking to me out of a burning bush, but at the end of the day, I've got to convince my colleagues, I've got to speak to the church leaders, I've got to speak to my board. At the end of the day, it's the people who will judge me, and they will say, who does she think she is? Who does he think he is? God answers the credibility question by showing Moses what he's capable of. What is that in your hand? And this is how God answers our credibility question. What are you holding? What are your gifts? What are your capabilities? What are your skills? But more than that, what is your history? Who are you? What are you holding? But this wasn't the fundamental issue for Moses, because he had another question coming. And the third question was a reliability question. And we see it in Exodus 4, verse 13. Moses says, oh Lord, please send somebody else to do it. In other words, surely there must be someone that would do a better job of this than me. And it's the question we ask when we have to get out of our comfort zones. It's the question we're faced with every time we encounter a major challenge that is totally unfamiliar to us. Reliability issues are issues that arise as a result of being stretched beyond what we're used to. And the reliability question wonders, am I really up to it? Can I do this? The problem with this question is it sounds very spiritual. No, Lord, not me. You find somebody else. It sounds really spiritual, really humble, really self-effacing, but oftentimes it can be rooted in pride. Lord, I actually know myself better than you know me. Or fear. Lord, I shouldn't. Lord, I can't. Lord, I won't. And it's no wonder that we read in verse 14, then the Lord's anger burned against Moses. The challenge of leading others emerges out of the challenge of leading ourselves. And we can't lead others through those paths unless we ourselves have made the journey. Leading ourselves is a challenge because we come with baggage. Moses had a problem. There were things he knew about himself that possibly nobody else in the whole world knew. And those things posed a very real threat to his ability to lead others well. And most of the issues were rooted in his identity, who he understood himself to be. At some point, read the entire story of Moses from Exodus through Deuteronomy. But for now, I just want to summarize some parts of it for you. So Moses is a Hebrew boy, but he's not just any Hebrew boy. He's a Hebrew boy who's raised by an Egyptian family, and not just any Egyptian family, but Pharaoh's family. He's raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. The same Pharaoh who commanded and sanctioned the genocide of all male Hebrews of his age. In other words, he lives with the people who despise what he stands for, who feel superior to him and to his people. And according to Exodus 2:11, Moses actually knew who his people were. He would often go out to watch them, working. He'd been nurturing a hatred for the Egyptians and longed to belong to the Hebrews. And then one day, he sees an Egyptian slave driver beating a Hebrew slave, and he kills him in an act of premeditated murder. How do we know it was premeditated? We're told in Exodus 2:12, he's glancing this way and that. And having taken the law into his own hands, he soon discovers that he isn't accepted by his own people either. The very next day, he sees two Hebrews fighting together, and he goes to try to break up the fight, and their response to him, one of them says to him, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" They don't see him as a Hebrew. Interestingly, once Pharaoh gets wind of the situation, he also concludes that Moses is at best a common murderer and at worst a threat to all Egyptians. And it's at this point in the story we come to understand there's very little love lost between the two of them. In Exodus 2:14, then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." And Exodus 2:15, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. It's not exactly the kind of adopted grandfather you'd wish for. There are no references in the text to Moses' royal credentials. Pharaoh taking him aside, saying, "It's okay, you're part of the royal family, don't worry, we'll smooth this over." Instead, Pharaoh sees it as an opportunity. Get rid of him. So we meet Moses caught up in a cycle of rejection. We meet him in a place where he's rejected by those who raised him, rejected by those he properly belongs to, and we meet him struggling with his own need to belong. Struggling with his own hurt and resentment, and like many of us, Moses had got stuck at that point in his journey. There are some things we know about ourselves that if we're not careful, they will hinder us from responding to our true calling in every season of leadership and ministry. The issues differ for each one of us depending on our history, our experiences, our gender, our ethnicity. All the stuff that happens, our journey and our temptations, whatever the case, there are things, issues that we recognize in ourselves that we ignore at our peril. Moses was a shepherd. He'd been tending his father's sheep at the point in the story that we meet him. Perhaps he believed that this was all he was capable of. Perhaps he believed this was all he wanted to do. But God arrested him at that point, met him, and challenged him to face up to those issues that had stalled him. Moses was good at leading sheep, but now he was required to lead people, and in time he would lead a nation. The problem was that Moses was stuck in the muddy pit of his past life. He'd been out of Egypt for 40 years, and he still hadn't resolved his hurts and pains. He'd got married, he had a child, he'd taken on a new identity, he had a new job, he was in another land, And he still hadn't dealt with the stuff he knew about himself. You see, it doesn't really matter how long you've been a Christian. It doesn't even matter what credentials you think you have, what letters are after your name or before your name, what medals you wear, what car you drive or house you live in. You may have got married, you had children, become titled, but if you have not dealt with the stuff you know about yourself that maybe nobody else knows, you will get stuck in your leadership. If you're going to rescue anybody or anything, help anybody or anything, release anybody or anything, you must deal with the things you know about you. Secret sins, secret desires that would destroy you if you let them. The need that would consume, the fear that would hinder. What do you know about you that you've kept to yourself? What do you know that you've tried to hide? Secret longings, resentment, pride, secret jealousies, inferiority, inadequacy. What Moses knew about himself almost prevented him from really getting started in his calling. He almost settled for something much less than God's best plan for his life. Like all good fairy stories, once upon a time in Exodus 1, Moses thought he knew exactly who he was. He thought he knew exactly what he had to do. And then we get to Exodus chapter 2, and suddenly he's a man feeling crushed, rejected, not believing that there's anything useful he can do in the entire world except for raise sheep. And by this time, he didn't even want to know about the people. You can almost hear him responding when God turns up on his doorstep. Responding to God. What does this have to do with me? And yet God challenged him 40 years later to face up to what he knew about himself, to stop running and to deal with it. And in leadership, we are trained to concentrate on dealing with the issues that others bring to us. So sometimes it's very hard to see the issues that stare back at us from the bathroom mirror every morning. If you want to get properly started at all in God's purposes, in this season of your life, you'll have to come face to face with what you know about yourself. Address those things, grow in your leadership. And as Moses reluctantly accepted God's assessment, he moved to a whole new level in his leadership, and he took up the challenge to push beyond himself, to align himself with God's purposes more fully. So the first question, are you dealing with what you know about yourself that perhaps no one else knows? Once you begin dealing with this, a whole new hurdle, the next pain barrier comes. And this time it's what someone else knows about you that you may not know. So let me continue Moses' story. We're heading to Exodus 18 in just a moment. But just to summarize his story, after the rejection, abandonment, resentment, and murder, the escape and the despair, after the acceptance of a new people and family, after the reluctance, the fear, the staff, the snake, the plague of blood, of frogs, of gnats, of flies on livestock, the plague of hail, of locusts, of darkness, the death of Egypt's firstborn, the Passover, the Exodus, the consecration, the Red Sea, after the song and dance, water from a rock, manna and quail, and the defeat of the Amalekites, the Moses who said in Exodus 6:12, if the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me since I speak with faltering lips? Is a very different man from the Moses who speaks in Exodus 14:13. Do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. In fact, after doing everything that Moses had never dreamed possible in his lifetime, he faces this second major barrier, what someone else knows about him that he couldn't see for himself. Exodus 18, we're going to read a few verses from there, from verse 13. The next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. When his father-in-law saw all that Moses was doing for the people, he said, what is this you're doing for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? Moses answered him, because the people come to me to seek God's will. Whenever they have a dispute, it's brought to me, and I decide between the parties and inform them of God's decrees and laws. Moses' father-in-law replied, what you're doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will only wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy for you. You cannot handle it alone. Listen now to me, and I will give you some advice, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God and bring their disputes to him. Teach them the decrees and laws and show them the way to live and the duties they are to perform. But select capable men from all the men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you. If you do this and God so commands, you'll be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. Verse 24, Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. When you are making progress as a leader, you will always reach a place where there are things that others know about you that you may not know about yourself. These things will be both positive and some of them will be negative. If you are making any significant progress as a leader at all, you will eventually hear something like this. What is this you are doing? And if you are profoundly blessed and someone truly cares about your progress and development as a leader, you will also hear this. What you are doing is not good. It's interesting, isn't it, that Moses in his lifetime goes through a phase or begins in a phase where he believes he can do absolutely nothing for the people. And then he ends up in a phase where he believes he's the only one who can do anything for the people. Come on, pastors. I may not be able to see, but I know you're there. In Western society, we think we've graduated when we stop taking advice from anybody. I know enough now. I've seen all this stuff. I know what to do. I don't know you who's behind me. I don't need you who's behind me to tell me or to give me advice on something. We often view correction as a sign of failure in our society. That's why so many leaders avoid feedback. And that's why we can be so superficial in our appraisal processes when we have them. Yet the scriptures are clear that correction is a sign of growth. We should expect it in this journey. The Message puts it like this in Hebrews 12:6. It's the child he loves that he disciplines. The child he embraces, he also corrects. In the Bible, criticism or correction is not a sign of failure or disaster. It's not necessarily a personal attack. Correction may simply be a sign of growth, that actually you've reached a place beyond which you need help. If you seldom hear the words, "What is this you are doing?" it may be that you're not doing anything worth talking about. Or it may be that people don't care enough about you to tell you. Hopefully that's not the case. Or it may be that you're as prickly as a hedgehog and people don't want to get into that territory with you. And they've given up trying to help you to grow. If you are too proud or arrogant to take correction or direction as a leader, you will short-circuit your leadership. You will short-circuit your own development. Why? Because there will always be things that others know about you that you will not know about yourself. I don't know if there are any here who have done biology or physiology. But if you have, you will know that we are created with a blind spot, literally, in our eyes. That part of the retina that doesn't receive light, that's insensitive to light. That's why stars appear to twinkle at night. Why would God create us with a blind spot? And yet that's what he's done for us as leaders. There are some things we're not supposed to see. Other people are supposed to see them. It's a reminder that we are created for community, for relationships with others. You may not realize that you are moody, but trust me, someone else knows. You may not realize you're bullish, but somebody else knows. You may not realize you're manipulative, but somebody knows. God places us in community for this very reason. You know, the most amazing thing about this part of the story isn't that Moses delegated. Yes, it's amazing, you know, he did delegate and he set it out for people. The most amazing thing about this part of the story is that he took advice and acted on advice from somebody else who was not leading 2 million people through the wilderness at the time. The person you need at a point of growth is the person who is carrying the wisdom of God for you. And you may discover that they are not doing the same thing as you and that they're not even ahead of you, as it were, in the process. God places us in community because we are incapable of developing without the help of others. In the same way that others help us to identify our negative traits, they also help us to see our positive. Do you know that you're really good when you're speaking with young people? Do you realize that you're very good in a civic context? The way you spoke to the mayor, the way that you dealt with that situation? Do you know you're very good on strategy? No, actually, I hadn't even thought about it. Am I? They help us to see these things. And sometimes we need to hear them saying to us, what is this that you're doing? But sometimes we need to hear, what is this that you're doing? Because our actions are toxic and they're hurting other people. A friend of mine describes people like this as being like leaky barrels of gunpowder. They go about their daily work from week to week, doing the things that they do for God, until some bright spark shows up. We all need to be confronted with our power as well as our deficiencies. And sometimes the people who are on the receiving end of our leadership need to be the ones to tell us. Gone are the days when leadership was all about one person left to do all the work. Today, the best leaders collaborate together. They share the load. They involve others in their leadership. The best leaders allow a degree of vulnerability, and it's not easy to do that because the stuff that comes with the leadership is often very, very difficult and sometimes painful. Pray that God will give you a Jethro, someone who will love you enough not just to notice, but also to tell you the truth about yourself. I'm greatly blessed because I have mentors, and up until recently, I had a coach. I also have peer leaders. I mentor a number of leaders, none of who feel that they can't feedback or tell me the truth about myself. I sometimes wish that they did feel a bit, that was a bit harder to do. Give people permission, not just to notice, but to speak. And when they speak, listen. It may be hard. It's always hard. But listen. Is there a kernel of truth? Moses didn't realize that what he was doing was so destructive, not just to himself. Here's the irony. He thought he was helping. I'm trying to solve their problems. And his father-in-law says, you're going to kill yourself and you're going to kill them. And we're told Moses listened to his father-in-law and did everything he said. How we respond to correction and direction is just as important as recognizing that at some point in our leadership journey, we're going to need it. Create the environment for it. If you want to become an effective leader, you will have to ask for help and you have to learn to listen to others. The most dangerous leaders seldom listen. What Moses knew about himself, that others didn't know almost prevented him from getting started on God's purpose for his life. What others knew about Moses that he was unaware of almost prevented him from making progress in God's purposes. In fact, according to Jethro, he'd almost destroyed himself and everybody else. In this phase of leadership, Moses is leading up to 2 million people through the wilderness. But in order to go to the next level of leadership, where he would lead the people into the promised land, God's ultimate goal, there was a final barrier he was going to have to break through. Final hurdle he was going to have to overcome. There are some things that neither you nor anyone else knows about you, but God alone knows. And if you want to know, you have to go to God to get it. I'm going to read from Numbers 20, a few verses there from verse 2. That helps us to see this. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this desert, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You'll bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink." So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." I'm always shocked when I read that passage. It never fails to shock me. And at first sight, when you read the passage, it seems to be an extreme response on God's part to a minor mistake on Moses' part. And if we're not careful when we read passages like this, the impression that we get of God is of a God who is cruel and hard, a God who is capricious, a God who just changes his mind just like that. So we actually have to step away from the passage and take a long, cool look down the background and down the history of Moses to see why this emerges at this point. Because as we begin to take a look at Moses' life, we begin to see that this isn't just a one-off event, but it's a culmination of habitual patterns of behavior. And what the story shows us is a recurring pattern of activity in Moses' life, a major flaw in his personality that's been left unresolved for years, that has become almost invisible, almost imperceptible. That's why even with the best will in the world, there are some things that neither you nor anyone else knows or notices about you, that God alone knows. Moses' relationship with God had always been remarkable. There was only one other thing that competed with his relationship with God, and that was his relationship with the people. There were moments in Moses' life when the people loomed large in his thinking, sometimes eclipsing his relationship with God. At key points, he fears them more than he fears God. At key points, he loves them more than he loves God. At key points, he needs them more than he needs God. And one day when Moses is coming down a mountainside with two stones hand-carved by God. Any one of you got one of those? Hand-carved by God. He sees what the people are doing in the valley and he smashes the stones. And here's the challenge for us as church leaders. The challenge is to be careful that our relationship with the people that we have been called to lead and called to serve does not cause us to destroy what God has given and entrusted to us. Particularly when we're dealing with Christians, because they have the power to disappoint us the most. To every onlooker, Moses was a man of God. the meekest man on earth, a great prophet. He stood in the presence of God, and God's presence had rubbed off onto him, that so much that when he left God's presence, people would say, you know what, you've got to cover up your friendship with God. We can't cope with the light. This is the man. And yet, for years, his relationship with the people had threatened his loyalty and commitment to God. It led him to be casual with God in this moment of angry outburst at the people. And once again, he disregards the command of God. He strikes the stone in anger, not once but twice, instead of speaking to it. And it's this unresolved relationship with the people that loses him his ticket to the promised land. This unresolved relationship with the people that leads to a somewhat laissez-faire behavior with God. Leaders lead people, but first we have to learn to lead ourselves. There will always be things that you and no one else but God knows about you. Self-awareness, self-reflection, good friendships will get you started on God's purposes for your life. Even some psychometric profiling, etc., will help. Honest co-workers and a good supervisor, a good mentor, a good coach, and even feedback from those who are directly impacted by your leadership will enable you to make progress in your leadership. But it will not help unless there's some degree of vulnerability on your part. But there are some things that you will only learn about yourself through a God-given revelation. You have to sit in the presence of God and wait for it. You have to ask him for it. Take a retreat. Pray over what you do, how you do it, why you do it. What are my motivations for this? What's this really about? Is this really about honoring God, or is it really about the people and how they see me? Ask God for his insights into your leadership, because it's the God-given revelations that enable us to go beyond starting to progressing to completing our God-given assignments. God will always show us what we and nobody else knows about us if we spend time in his presence and ask him tough questions about ourselves. I often say to the leaders I work with, from time to time, sit yourself at the bottom of your bed and have a good conversation with yourself. Just don't do it in public, and don't answer yourself back in public, whatever else you do. The truth about ourselves is sometimes ugly, sometimes wonderful. But it's always a matter of time before it surfaces, and it will surface. We're just not clever enough to suppress that stuff. How we respond to it will show us who we really are, and it will show others who we really are too. The Bible is not a fairy story, and God is not Father Christmas. Whether we like it or not, mercy and judgment are still at the center of the gospel message. Not the kind of judgment that excludes us from heaven, but the kind where God says, you're not the right person to complete this assignment. I need someone else. Not every story in the Bible has a happy ending. Moses was the king of the second chance. He'd had them over and over again. But he never dealt with the little indicators that God gave him. He saw how angry God was with him, in spite of being given so much assurance, so many powerful tools, a whole burning bush. His fear of the people still eclipsed the call. Just as at the end of his time, anger with them eclipsed a requirement that he honor the Lord. Moses did not go into the promised land. He didn't lead them there. He was and is still a great leader, but he didn't complete his assignment. I don't know about you, but I know for myself, I want to finish, and I want to finish well. If you want to be an effective leader, you will have to learn to lead from the inside out. God will challenge you as he did Moses. 3 cycles, 3 overlapping hurdles. Deal with the things you know about yourself that perhaps nobody else knows. Ask others and listen to them in order to deal with the things they know that you may not be aware of. But if you want to complete your assignment, ask God to reveal what you and maybe nobody else knows, but God alone knows. Stuff we don't even notice anymore. These things may dismay or delight us, but ultimately they determine whether we get to complete the course that God has set before us. God is a God on a mission. I want to be on that mission too. Let's stand together.